Hello, YouTube. This is Cameron Bertuzzi with Capturing Christianity, and today I'm talking with a philosopher named Plato. Yes, that is correct. I'm talking with Dr. Alex Plato about his conversion from Protestantism to Catholicism, and that is his real name. And let's talk about that first. Why are you named Plato?
That's a really good question. Actually, my ancestors were named Platts with a Z on the end, and then they came to America in 1846 or so and changed their name to Plato eventually. So I don't know if I'm related to the real Plato, but I could be.
Yeah. And let me also mention this at the very beginning of this is that I understand that Plato's his microphone is going to be a little bit softer than mine. There's not a lot I can do about that unless Alex just wants to speak like super loudly. That's the only way for us to solve this problem. But either way, I think it's going to be completely audible. Like you're going to be able to follow along with us today. So let's just jump right in. Where should we begin in your story from? Okay, so let me say this. I actually met you in person recently, and your story, like from Protestantism to Catholicism, and I'm not Catholic yet, but it mirrored mine in a lot of ways. And I just thought it would be helpful for people who watch this channel to hear your story. So let's get into some of the details about your story. Start where should we begin in your journey from Protestantism to Catholicism? Where should we start?
Well, we can start at the beginning. That's always a good place.
Okay.
So my mom is a practicing Protestant Christian, and my father is an unbaptized person. He is not anti-Christian or anything, but he's never had practiced Christianity or been baptized or anything. He'll go to church, with my mom on Christmas or Easter, things like that. So I was raised in that environment, and my mom raised all of us. I have a twin brother named Nick Plato and a sister, Emily, and we were all raised in the Presbyterian Church, the liberal Presbyterian Church, so the PCUSA. And up until seventh grade or so, and then my mom, as they started to sort of become more liberal, she wanted to hear more teaching from the Bible, and rather than more political messages. And so she went to the Baptist church in my hometown, Lakeview, Oregon. And then I became a Baptist. I was baptized again. So I was baptized as a 3-year-old, as a Presbyterian, and then later on as a teenager in the Baptist church. And then I went to a Baptist college. And then things started to kind of change with my faith, like many people that go to college. So that's kind of my upbringing was liberal Presbyterian, and then Baptist, kind of a very conservative sort of Baptist. It wasn't officially in a CBA type parachurch group, but it was sort of that flavor, I guess I'd say. Yeah. So I mean that's sort of my upbringing, and then when I was in college, I think things started to happen to me. I had already sort of been baptized into the intellectual life because one of my science teachers in high school, an absolutely amazing person, himself has a twin. And his name is Claire Thomas, and I love the man so much. And he taught me creation science when I was in high school. And so I got into all these creation evolution debates with my dad and other people. And I got really interested in apologetics because I realized here we are looking at Archaeopteryx, for example, and he sees this as evidence for evolution. And I see this as evidence for creationism. I'm like, how do we see the same thing, but see it as different sorts of evidence? And so then I realized there's presuppositions and there's sort of worldview issues about, like my dad didn't at that time believe that God existed. And so I thought, well, that's why he doesn't see the evidence the way. So well, how do I argue with him that God exists? And so I got into apologetics, C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton, Ravi Zacharias, Josh McDowell, Francis Schaeffer, J.P. Moreland, Doug Guyvett, like all these people. I got into apologetics to deal with that issue. And then I was in college at that time. I was into apologetics, really interested in all those issues, and taking any classes I could that were on that topic. And then I kind of started to have a crisis of faith, and I started to doubt lots of things. I started to wonder, why do I think this Bible is all that it's purported to be? Why do I think this is divinely inspired? Why do I think this is inerrant? Why do I even trust this at all? Maybe I'm just believing this because my mom taught me that. And then I got into all these skeptical worries, in epistemology. So I tell people I got conted in college. I got conted at a Baptist college. I don't think they intended that, of course. So then I was in this point of view, and I got to the point where I basically tried to become an atheist. And what I mean by tried is I could doubt everything. I found reasons against certain things, and of course that's going up against the kind of evidence I'd got through apologetics and everything. And I got to the point where psychologically I thought, my experience of God that I sort of self-interpret as having, right, could just be a projection, like I'm projecting my father figure or whatever out onto the cosmos, kind of that way. And I thought, well, if that was true, then the evidence would look the same to me. So it's kind of like the external world skeptical problem. If we were brains in vats, the evidence would look just like this anyway, supposedly. So I was in that situation. I couldn't figure out how to get out. So I got kind of depressed. And I remember at one point, one of my friends at Western Baptist came up to me and he says, where's your joy, brother? And that, I think, was a moment of grace. Like the light of grace came into me. And I feel like at that point, I realized something's wrong with what's happening to me. Something isn't right. I guess I could say morally speaking. And so then I kept practicing Christianity, and eventually those reasons that were available in the apologetical arguments kind of had more weight, and I could see my way past the sort of projection sort of thing. And I never actually became an atheist. But I left Western Baptist as a mere Christian. Like I wanted to just defend mere Christianity. I didn't care about differences. I was myself at that time a kind of Baptistic, kind of evangelical. And so that then took me to my grad program, which is Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. And I went there because I'd read J.P. Moreland's book, Love Your God with All Your Mind. And that, put a bee under my bonnet to fight anti-intellectualism. So these people that didn't care about apologetics or history or anything in my own sort of religious tradition. And I read Os Guinness's book, Fit Bodies, Fat Minds, Why Evangelicals Don't Think and What to Do About It. And so then my crusade was like anti-intellectualism. And I wanted to go study philosophy, and I wanted to go to Oxford. And so I went to Talbot School of Theology because I knew that people could go to Oxford after that. And they had a very successful program. And I went there, and I was kind of a wandering evangelical in a certain way. Like I was very discontent with certain things in the evangelical world, my experience liturgically, historically, philosophically, theologically. I had all these questions and doubts and everything still, but I defended mere Christianity. I really cared about that, and I was absolutely committed to that. And then I started a New Testament studies degree at the same time I was doing this philosophy of religion and ethics degree, master's degree at Talbot, because I discovered N.T. Wright in one of my classes. And N.T. Wright kind of re-enchanted me with theology. I thought, wow, theology can be really deep, really philosophically responsible. And he defends this idea of critical realism. And so philosophically or epistemologically, and I thought that's really important. And so I got into that whole thing, and eventually through that I became an Anglican. I was sitting in a class, and one of my friends in that class leaned over to me and he said, "Hey, I know you're kind of trying to find another church right now, and you don't want to church hop around and whatnot. And why don't you come to this Anglican church with me?" And I was like, all right, I'll try that. Nothing against it. And I thought, I'm going to give this 2 weeks because I didn't want to church hop. If I think it's good enough for 2 weeks, then I'm going to commit to being an Anglican for 1 year. And so after 2 weeks, I was absolutely sold. I loved it. I was in the choir, right? I sang beautiful English polyphony. I have a musical background as well. And so it was just beautiful organ music, traditional, ad orientem, traditional Anglican, very beautiful, very small little chapel in California there. And I remember just when I would go to mass, I would go to the service there, and everything was meaningful. Everywhere I looked, the stained glass windows, I was oriented toward a crucifix, the whole thing was oriented in a way that was meaningful constantly. Whereas my experience as an evangelical, my mind was always wandering to critiquing the sermon or critiquing the music or critiquing the space. And it was like so noisy. I remember praying, God, please just help me to worship you. I don't want all this. And so then I went to the Anglican Church for 3.5 years, and it was a hospital for my soul. It was really great for me. And then eventually I became a Catholic, and there's more to that, but there's the kind of outline.
Yeah. Yeah, there's just a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was good. That was like a good weaving of your story And I felt like now I know you better, even though, because when you and I talked, it was more like we just started where you basically just left off. You're
Yeah.
like, okay,
Yeah.
here are the, you were like, I was agnostic on basically everything, all of these different doctrines. And then
Yep.
eventually I worked through that and got to where I am now, which I think that like that is probably the most valuable thing that I want to talk about today with you
Absolutely.
is because your story is really interesting to me because you started like you were eventually you got to a point where and maybe I'll just let you tell this story, but you eventually got to a point where you were agnostic about all these different Catholic doctrines. And then you were like, well, what do I do at this point? Because I want to be Catholic,
Right.
but what do I like, but I can't get there because I'm agnostic on all of these different doctrines. Why don't you fill out the story for us and then we'll get deeper into it.
Sure. So I had kind of all these outstanding criticisms of the kind of evangelical theological system that I had inherited from my upbringing, right? And I, had skepticized many of those, but I never completely overturned like the inspiration of Scripture or the inerrancy of Scripture or the kind of canonicity problem. I could kind of see arguments both ways. And then when I got into the Anglican Church, I became very interested in the Catholic question right from the get-go because my best friend Gerard is a theologian, and we had hundreds of hours of conversation. And another one of my great friends, Jeremy Daggett, he also converted. And another one of my great friends, Aaron Clark, he converted. Right in my and so I had all these friends of mine that had converted, and so I had all these conversations with them. And I was constantly airing out my objection to Catholic doctrines, like just every single one I could think of, and would say, well, here's some reasons why I don't think that. And then they would kind of push back and say, well, here's some reasons to rebut you, and maybe here's some additional reasons why we believe these things. And I got to, on every issue, like I said, just down to for 3 years or so. I mean, working through issues, getting to where I was sort of agnostic on every one. But I did at that point want to be Catholic. I saw that this is the sort of arrangement that I could sort of imagine God making if he wanted to bring people to himself, right? He would arrange this sort of sacramental system and this and confession, right? And Holy Eucharist and have a church where there's a teaching office and that can help interpret Scripture and all this. And it made sense to me, but I couldn't believe those things. I couldn't tell myself, I believe in transubstantiation, right? I believe in the Immaculate Conception. I couldn't say those things to myself. So I thought I could never authentically become a Catholic because I can't say those things are true. But neither could I say they were false. And so then I remember when I was at that point, of course, I got up to the papacy issue. And I thought, well, maybe this is, one issue. Again, I was agnostic on that. And I thought, well, if that could be solved somehow, right? Kind of like where I imagine similar kind of where you're at. If I could solve that one, that would kind of give me like an epistemic bump with all the rest of the doctrines. And then it would, all the pieces would kind of be in place. And so I was stuck for 2 years trying to figure that out. And I remember I had many arguments and discussions with Jared about the notion of believing or belief. Like I would say, I don't believe this. And he would say, well, that's not what we mean by the word belief. I was like, well, that's what I mean. So we had this disagreement about the nature of belief itself. What does that mean? And so I understood it to be, I'm basically making a judgment. I'm thinking that something's true. And so sort of analogous to where you turn and I'm like, oh, here's a person you see, and that's believing. It's involuntary in a certain way, right? You don't have direct doxastic voluntarism on that view. You can't directly just will to believe there's a pink elephant above you right now. So that was my concept I was working with. And so I took this old Roman profession of faith, like the Tridentine profession of faith. You can look it up if you want online and find it. And there's all these things that are in contradistinction to the Protestant, the Protestant Reformation at that time. And it says, I believe in the salutary use of relics, and I believe in prayers to the saints, and I affirm the Immaculate Conception, and I accept, right, the authority of the Church, and all these verbs. I affirm, I accept, I believe, and every single one of them, I had these little notes I made underneath each item. And I was like, well, I don't affirm the opposite. I don't affirm it, but I don't affirm the opposite, and I don't accept this, and I don't accept the opposite. And so that, again, agnostic on every issue. And I took that profession of faith to a friend and a priest, and also a PhD candidate at St. Louis University. So another part of my story is I went to St. Louis University to do my PhD after Talbot. And I met this priest named Father Andrew Pinsett. And I remember I took him that profession of faith. And I sat down with him. I'm like, this is where I'm at. I really want to be Catholic. but I just can't do it. I can't be authentic. I would be lying to myself if I said I affirm these things, I accept these things. And he read the whole thing. He says, "You're ready to go." I was like, "What?" And he said, "Are you willing to believe?" And that was his exact wording. I remember that specifically. "Are you willing to believe?" And that struck me because that was, for one, has ambiguous, has two meanings at least. And so one meaning was, are you ready to believe? And of course, I had been ready for years, right? And then, are you endeavoring to believe? And that's what I was doing. That's why I was meeting with him. And so I said, yes, I'm ready and I'm endeavoring. And he said, well, you just need to go make an act of faith now, a profession of faith in public. And I said, no, I can't do that because, again, I'm not
Yeah,
authentic.
I can't.
And so,
I wouldn't be able to do that either.
Exactly. And so then he said, well, go read Aquinas on faith. And I got I forget which articles or which questions it is. But he basically, in that section, Aquinas says what reason it does for you, right, is reason removes obstacles and shows you that none of these mysteries of the faith are impossible. So that's like such a minimum bar, right? That, the Trinity is not impossible. The incarnation is not impossible, right? Transubstantiation, not impossible, right? The papacy, the authoritative claims, and the infallibility of the church in general, not impossible. I was like, okay. And that's all there was. So I kind of realized I had been a rationalist in a certain way. I had thought that I had to have all these reasons worked out that would then give me evidence for these mysteries. And so I realized I kind of had a double standard in a certain way. Like, I already accepted the Trinity and I already accepted the incarnation. And so then I have all these other doctrines. I'm like, why am I having a different standard of belief, so to speak, for these rather than these? And I couldn't resolve that other than, well, I already have trust in the church in a certain way because they're the ones who developed this in actual history, right? The Trinity, incarnation, these sort of things. And I said, well, a certain way I do trust them. Now I don't know if it's infallible, right? I don't know if the papal infallibility claims on top of general church infallibility is also the case. But I did see I kind of already believed those and I already trusted that. And so then in order to be consistent, right, that was a motivation for me. But it wasn't an evidential bump that I was getting. So again, on the papacy, like I told you when we were in person in my backyard, it wasn't like some extra bit of evidence on top for me. I already saw the claims that you've explained on your show before, and I'm talking about there's evidence for it. And yeah, there's some evidence against it. And I said if I had to choose between, the biblical case for sola scriptura and the biblical case for the papacy, even though I was disappointed with both of them, right, from a philosopher's point of view, I was like, well, I'd bet on this papacy case if I had to bet. And so then to me, it was ultimately a matter of trust, a matter of my circle of trust sort of changing. And that was really hard because a lot of my most beloved mentors and friends who are Protestant, I kind of had to figure out, well, why don't they believe? Like, what's the difference, And I had to work through that. And so then I had to see.
Can I?
Yeah, jump in.
I just wanted to pause a moment. So you were working through, like, you were trying to be consistent with your epistemology, I suppose, because what you're saying is that, like, you still had some beliefs that, like, were not based on this, like, rational process of, like, going through and looking for the evidence for and against, but you nevertheless, like, had those beliefs, like, about the Trinity and whatnot. And is that what you're saying? Like, when it comes to these other Catholic doctrines, like, you just realized that you had a double standard there, like you didn't have this really high bar of evidence that was required in order to hold these beliefs with respect to, like, the Trinity or these other things. But then when it came to certain Catholic doctrines, like, you had that higher standard, that higher bar that needed to be met in order to hold that. Is that what you're saying? Like, that's what you realized?
I think something like that. But when I was an Anglican, I tried to invent, right, a way of imagining Christianity where I didn't have to choose between Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, but I was already kind of convinced of what I call history's Christianity. The way that we've worshiped through time, the way that we've thought through time, this has an importance, right? And though I didn't hold that the church was an infallible teacher, I thought, well, these people do, right? The Orthodox and the Catholics. And so then I developed this model that I called reason in community that allows us to, in my mind anyway, it allowed us to disagree, right? But if we were all moral, right? And if we were all good and we were all patient and we were all loving, we would allow lots of toleration of disagreement, and it wouldn't break apart the Christian church, because I really cared about that, Jesus' prayer in John 17 about that we would all be one. I really cared about that, and that made sense to me. And so I thought, how do I do this if I can't go all the way to this Orthodox or Catholic thing and say, well, we kind of have the fullness of truth? So they're wrong about that claim, but they have part of it. And so then what I had to do to do that is basically treat every doctrine like the Trinity as, technically speaking, provisional. So I thought maybe, Christianity is going to go on for another 100,000 years. And maybe we'll find like 6th and 7th Corinthians, where Paul says that the doctrine of the Trinity isn't the way we should think about it. Right. And so I don't know that. So in the meantime, we have to hold that it's possible for these to be overturned. But until we get to that point, of course, all the weight of the evidence is on the Trinity from the arguments. I thought there were arguments from Scripture and tradition and all these things that you can get. And I kind of took myself to be grounding my belief on those arguments, if that makes sense. Where I think in reality, I already had the belief in the Trinity. I was already raised with that understanding. And then I went and found arguments that could support it. So it's like we were talking about Reformed epistemology, right? Where you can have non-inferential justification, but that doesn't mean you can't go find arguments that also support what you believe and get inferential support, right? So you can have inferential support, and you can have your belief is actually non-inferentially supported. So like, what do I say? Directly grounded or something.
Yeah, you could have both types of warrant, I suppose.
Yes.
You have inferential and non-inferential warrant.
Yes. So as I was a kind of rationalist, as I take myself to have been, I thought that my grounds were actually all those arguments I was articulating. And it's not that those didn't provide support. But I mean, here's a parallel case. We believe that Julius Caesar existed, right? That he was assassinated, right? That he was an ancient Roman. We believe that. Well, what's your grounds for that? Do you have arguments for why you believe that? No, you just were taught that, and so you believe it. But you can go find supporting arguments if you want, right? But that's not why I actually think that's certain. Any argument that I could find, to me, seems like the premises would be less certain than I already started with. So the support I get from arguments for that, some, I don't know, giant abductive case, right, wouldn't actually be my grounds. So I started to think, this reason in community view is a rationalist view. And then my friend Gerard challenged me, and he said, well, if that's the case, how is this divine revelation? How is what you get out of reason in community divine revelation? And that was one of his challenges to me, among many others.
I don't see how that's relevant. What's the relevance of this?
So if, let's say, the Catholics are claiming it's divinely revealed that the church is infallible, right? The Anglicans are claiming that that's not divinely revealed, right? Let's say the Baptists are claiming that infant baptism, right, is wrong and heretical, and that's divinely revealed, right? So now everybody's claiming that they have a divine revelation, but they're all conflicting. So my view is to say, well, so basically you have to treat your beliefs as if they are not divine revelation, right? Because if you treat them as if they're divine revelation, then you're going to need to exclude those other people as heretics. Or unless you just say, well, divine revelation is just inherently vague. But then what kind of a divine revelation has God vouchsafed to us? If it's vague, right? And one person's essentials are different than another person's essentials. That was hard for me to square. And that wasn't, again, like some sort of knockdown argument for an infallible teaching office. But clearly that's one of the benefits of having an infallible teaching office is if God was to vouchsafe a divine revelation, right? Meaning something that is able to be applied and interpreted at any time in history, then there would need to be a teaching office that claims, right, we're infallible. Because if they weren't infallible, how could I know that God is guaranteeing or vouchsafing this revelation to me, as opposed to just my ideas about what revelation would be?
I want to get actually to this question of trust. That was one of the most interesting things that you talked about when we were speaking in person. You gave a really good analogy of your sister. Isn't it your sister that has like the really good memory, and your memory is like so?
Yes. No, it's not so. It's really bad.
Oh, it's just really bad. Okay. Yeah, I want to get to that. But before we get to that, I actually want to talk to the audience for just a second. I want to tell you about my guy. He's named Mark Lozano. And what he does is he provides an ethical screening of financial assets like stocks and cryptos and stuff. But you should be interested in this. If you're investing in anything, you need to be interested in what you're investing in. You need to make sure that they line up, these companies, these different financial assets. They've got to line up with your Christian values. And the cool thing is that Mark Lozano over at Christ Centered Capital, linked is in the description of this video, he's already done all of the hard work for you. So go check him out, christcenteredcapital.com. It's only $7 a month. He gives you all of the different stocks, cryptos, all the cool stuff that's happening that actually lines up with Christian values. He sends that to you on a weekly basis, $7 a month. But if you want, you can sign up today. Use the code ByTheWayCC. That's the code that he and I worked out. By the way, CC gets your first month for just $1. And then also 50% of his net profits actually go to charity. So this guy, I mean, he's doing everything right. He's providing an amazing service. And again, you've got to be interested in what you're putting your money into. As Christians, you've got to do that. And so again, he's done all the hard work for you. Go check him out, Mark Lozano over at christcenteredcapital.com. Use the link that I've got in the description of this video. Like, use that one so that he knows that I'm sending you over there. And yeah, that's pretty much it. He's also just like a super solid guy. Like he was an atheist, he became Christian, and then he became Catholic. And I'm not making, I say that, and I always feel bad when I say that, but he became like, I guess, mere Christian, and then he became Catholic. Anyway, he's a solid dude. That's all you need to know. He's awesome. So, all right. Now, Alex, let's go back to this this idea of trust, because that's like something I've still been thinking about. Is this idea of like, well, I'll let you explain it. You do a much better job at it than I do.
Well, so one thing I remember after I converted, I talked with a lot of my really good friends that are Protestant, and one thing that came up in those discussions is the doctrine of private judgment. So in the end, of course, all of us have to make our judgment on what we think, and we have to act in a certain way. We have to either assent or act in this according to this faith or not. So of course, in one sense, private judgment just means you're making a judgment and not someone else, right? But in another sense, the doctrine of private judgment has to do with the content of the faith. Whereas with my sister, I realized that if I want to remember something, like let's say some conversation I had 10 years ago and I barely remember even having it, then I'll ask my sister, well, what was it that I was saying that time, long time ago? And she'll remember things that I said that I don't even remember I said. And so when I accept her memory as giving me the content of what to believe, I am, of course, using my private judgment, right, to accept her memory. But I'm basically saying your memory is better than my memory, right? And so in a certain way, it's her memory judgments that's giving me the content of what I'm believing. And so I'm trusting her faculty, if you might say that. And of course, it's my private judgment, but that's not the doctrine of private judgment in the Protestant sense. That's the opposite to me. It seems like that's analogous to the church, right? Is this this social entity or this polity that exists in actual history going through time, right? Debating various questions when the community gets challenged, like Arius, for example. And Arianism challenges the very core of Christianity, right? And then there needs to be arguments that come forth to defend orthodoxy. And of course, Athanasius is famous for that. And then you go through history and you can follow this in, like, for example, John Henry Newman's Development of Doctrine, and see that each time there's these big debates about heresies going up, there's some debate that's had, and then there's some definition of heresy. And that further defines, right, the nature of the faith. And so the church has this teaching office that is filled by different people at different times, giving lots of different arguments from different grounds, but it is like a faculty, if I could say that. And so it gives us the content, in my view, of what is the faith. And so then I trust it as knowing that faith better than I could. So here I am back to, when I'm trying to think about whether to become a Catholic, back at that moment. And I'm going through each of these individual issues, like weighing the arguments for prayers to saints, or weighing the arguments for the Immaculate Conception, or whatever. And I'm trying to deal with all these by myself. I'm acting like that office. So in a weird way, I'm acting like a single magisterium myself. And so with my sister analogy, I realized, well, who's more reliable, me or my sister? Well, my sister's more reliable. And of course, I have grounds to think that, right? I have reasons, right, prudential and epistemic for thinking that. Well, why can't that be exactly the same in the case of the church? So I trust it for the content, right, on my reasons, but then I'm assenting to this faculty. And I like to compare this point with C.S. Lewis. So one reason he didn't become Catholic is because he said, I could agree in theory with everything that the Catholic Church has said up to this point in time. But what I can't agree with is everything that it's going to say in the future. And to me, that defines the moment of trust. Do I trust that this faculty, so to speak, the magisterium, has been designed and entrusted and guided by God's providence, such that what it has said and what it's going to say is going to give me the faithful content of what Jesus and the apostles taught in the very beginning, right? And so that's my analogy with my sister's memory and the church, the faculty it has of explaining and interpreting the content of Jesus and the apostles' teaching.
How did this move you toward Catholicism?
I mean, that I realized that same thing when I got to a matter of faith, right? The issue of faith wasn't a matter of finding a belief, right, and having premises or arguments or grounds or some giant abductive case, right? And that case being so strong that I assent to that intellectually. Right? It was more like I believe that God, right, set up this church, right, to be this faculty because we need it, right? And there's marks in history that it is that, right? Of course, I was aware of some of those when I was investigating the church, like the lives of the saints, right? The practice through time, right, of liturgy, the development and building of culture, right? The miracles that occur that are just scads and scads of miracles. And of course, I was not against that because I was already believed that miracles were possible and actual. And so these are kind of the marks of credibility. And then when it came to the teaching office itself, I thought, wow, their arguments on certain issues are really good and really sophisticated, and more sophisticated than me on many points, than what I could come up with on myself. So it was something that could be trusted, right? Rather than I have independent epistemic reasons, right, to think that it was, right, that this is the way it had to be, or something like that. Now, I agree that once you have, like my comparison with Julius Caesar, once you have a belief, even if it's the thing that explains everything else, right, and your certainty of that is greater than any arguments you could create, you can still create and find arguments that support that sort of abductively or inferentially. So, and I think those are important indicators. And so after I became a Catholic, this weird thing happened where I realized that a lot of those arguments that had kind of got me closer and closer, kind of like the things you're teaching and you're talking about, that get you closer and closer, I realized that was kind of like a ladder that I crawled up. And then I sort of saw things in a clear way after I became Catholic. And then I kicked away that ladder. And those weren't really my grounds, right? My grounds had to do with more that this understanding or this Catholic worldview explains everything. There's nothing that it doesn't explain. And any arguments I come up with in a certain way are less certain than what I've already got as a person living the life of faith from within. So it's hard for me to articulate that because I'm not clear on my own epistemological theory, I guess I could say. But I don't know if that's making sense so far.
Yeah, the objection that I've got to this whole idea of trust and who you're putting your trust in has to do with like a Christian, a Protestant could say, yeah, it's not that I'm necessarily putting all of my trust in my own ability to reason and think and work out some issue or work out the issues. It's not that I'm doing that. I'm putting trust in whatever denomination that I'm currently a part of. So like if it's Anglicanism or if it's Lutheranism or Methodist or whatever, it's like that's the thing that you're putting your trust in. So you're still putting your trust in something else that's more reliable than just yourself. But that doesn't necessarily, like Catholicism isn't necessarily the thing that is most trustworthy, I suppose, is one response to this
Well,
this trust type
right.
consideration.
I think I see what you're saying. You're saying that there's multiple candidates for trust, and the Catholic Church isn't the only one, and so Protestants
Hmm.
already have trust. And I guess my response, just maybe to push back on that, is to say, if Jesus teaches that his mission is indefectible, right, and so he has this teaching that can't be defeated, you might say, then if he's going to vouchsafe this divine revelation and in time, and it's going to be something that can be continued through time after he leaves, right, then you're going to expect somebody to be claiming that they're that office, right? But for example, like Luther and the Lutherans didn't claim that, right? The only people that claim that are Orthodox and Catholic, right? That they have an infallible teaching office because Jesus had his mission to teach was indefectible. And so to me, those other candidates that you mentioned for trust are not the right kinds of candidates. They're not candidates for trusting God as vouchsafing this, right? This sort of like, yeah, God sort of teaches stuff, and then these interpreters who I trust to have gotten it right have it basically right. It's not, no, the assent that a Catholic and an Orthodox has to the faith is, what do I say, is unqualified.
So the line of infallibility is not broken, so to speak. I think is that kind of what you're getting at here? Like you've still got to have like an infallible teaching office
Yes, so the
as
infallible
part of the thing that you're trusting in.
yes, and that's like the faculty of memory, right? And of course, the person involved here is God, right? So God is the one who's
Yeah.
revealing stuff to us, and his memory, right, is kind of in this faculty or this office that's part of this actual societal entity or polity that exists as a matter of history that even secular people can point to and say, yeah, that's the Catholic Church, right, or that's the Orthodox Church. And so then if now the test of it isn't that this is infallible, but this could be infallible. So what I mean by that is when I look at the Lutheran creedal statements, it's not something that could be infallible, right? Because they're not even claiming it is. And so when the church says we're infallible, then you look at the conciliar infallibility through time, right? So leaving aside papal infallibility specifically just for a second and thinking about conciliar infallibility, right, is each moment that occurs throughout history is building on what went before, and it cannot contradict what went before. If it contradicted what went before, then it can't possibly be infallible. So if it's consistent throughout, then it can possibly be infallible, right? So what you get at best when you look at it sort of from a purely evidential point of view is candidates for possible infallible teaching offices. And to me, there's only two: Orthodox and Catholic.
So then this argument for you would, and I'm calling it an argument, but whatever
Sure.
you want to call this trust consideration would be a way of narrowing it down to at least Catholic, between Catholicism and Orthodox.
Yes, unless you can find some other candidates for infallible teaching authority.
And the reason why you need it to be infallible is because
when Christ says he's teaching, right, and
Uh-huh.
he gives us his truth, right, that's a mission, right, that can't be defeated. So since it's God, he's got a mission, and his mission includes teaching. He's prophet, priest, and king. So he's prophet, he's teacher, right? So he's got to have this office, his own office, right, continued through time. Now, the other response that some Protestants might give is, well, that's what the Bible is, right? The
Yeah.
Bible is the infallible, right, source of Christ's teaching, right? But then I get into comparisons. Like I said, well, what is the case for that? And the Protestant case that I heard for that at that time when I was considering converting
Sola Scriptura.
was sola scriptura, or maybe even a slightly weaker version. Like one of my mentors said, well, don't worry about the sola part. What about just scriptura? But that's hard because what scriptura is itself in dispute, right? And he said, well, okay, well, just pick the ones that aren't in dispute then, right? And leave aside the ones that aren't. But I'm like, but wait a minute, if it's divine revelation, I don't want to leave anything out. So I guess what I'm saying is the the infallibility that's in a book, right, is to me not the relevant kind. Because if Christ's office as teacher is going to be instantiated, as it were, right, it's got to be done where you can respond to what's going on in time through history, right? And so to make the Bible respond requires pastors, right? Which de facto Lutherans, Baptists, they're trusting pastors of various sorts, right? And authors like Calvin or whatever. So they're trusting people too, because people have to apply it to circumstances. So for example, when it comes to lots of important moral issues, right, the church tries to apply, or social political issues or economic issues, the church tries to apply its teaching, right, and extend it to those matters, and they can promulgate, right, new teaching in a council, right, if need be. So when I considered Orthodox versus Catholic, for example, I thought, well, the Orthodox, they can't call a council right now because they need the Pope, they need the chair of Peter, right? They need to be able to call an ecumenical council, and so their teaching office is sort of like on pause right now. And so that I thought, well, again, I guess it's possible God would allow his teaching office to be on pause for hundreds and hundreds of years, or I could say, well, through the Catholic understanding, it's not on pause. It's always relevant. It's always ready, every era, in season and out. So it can apply the teaching at any time, versus the pure biblical model is, well, it's up to us or our pastors or our community to somehow figure out how to apply it. And of course, there's many, many, many different ways of doing that.
Yeah, why don't we turn back now to the question of like Catholicism versus Orthodox? If this trust consideration gets us to at least ruling out all the other options except for those two, how did you decide between those two?
Yeah, so that consideration I just said was one of the main ones, which is that to me the teaching office in the Orthodox Church is sort of like on pause. It can't be unpaused until the Pope of Rome, right, the Bishop of Rome, comes into agreement, so to speak, with the Orthodox understanding, right? Which, as far as I can tell, isn't going to happen, right? I suppose it's theoretically possible. Versus the Catholic way, which is there have been multiple other councils declared and have operated and have been crucial to the ongoing life of the church on earth. And so its teaching office is alive and active, and the Orthodox one is on pause. Right? So not in a similar way, alive and active.
Did this argument play into your eventually becoming Catholic, or is this something that you like one of these sort of
it did
later considerations?
It did, because when I became an Anglican, I overtly in my mind committed to history's Christianity. I said, I'm never going to go back to the evangelical thing, right, that doesn't have sort of orthopraxis. Because I thought it would be so strange if God set up this whole thing and immediately it goes astray, right? And then there's this one argument some of my Protestant friends have given is, the Catholic Church, or this sort of big, the Constantine kind of transition to a sort of state religion church, like completely destroyed the church. And it was originally these house churches and this little thing, and it quickly went astray, right? And so then you have like how many hundreds of years where we don't really have authentic Christianity. Maybe you can trace a stream, like Philip Schaff tries to trace some stream through history to get finally up to the Protestant Reformation, where light dawns again. I thought that just doesn't make sense to me when you look at the people in actual history, what they did, their lives of holiness, right? Their understanding of scripture and philosophy and theology. It didn't make sense to me. So I thought, orthopraxis, right? Having a liturgical celebration that's around the Eucharist, right, is history's Christianity. So I can't go back to anything else. So then it was Anglican, Orthodox, Catholic was my debate. When I was an Anglican, I tried to defend that reason in community view, which in my mind problematized divine revelation itself. And so then the Orthodox Catholic thing is, well, that consideration I just gave about the teaching office being alive or on pause. And then I just thought, well, I am in fact a Westerner, and that is relevant. And so that's who I am. It's part of my identity. And so if I became an Eastern, then I would be sort of entering a different sort of tradition and way of thinking, right? And that didn't seem as natural or seemed contrary to my identity in a certain way. So that was also a consideration for me. But I'd
Yeah,
say that
that's really interesting. I've heard people talk about how the fact that like Eastern Orthodox is just not part of their culture, so it's like it's just too foreign.
yeah, yeah. So that was relevant to me. I mean, that's not as much a theological consideration like the first one, but that
Yeah.
there seems to me to be an appropriateness that churches have an enculturation within their people. That seems appropriate, right? I
Now,
mean, yeah.
forgive me, I'm probably not following, and it's totally my fault. I mean, you speak at like 1,000 miles an hour to me, and so I'm
Oh,
like just
sorry.
trying to keep up. I'm just trying to keep up. No, you don't actually speak fast. It's just your arguments are very sophisticated, and they're kind of like they're winding. So for me, it's like my brain just to wrap my mind around them.
Right.
It's difficult. I got to go slowly. So going back to this, consider why is the Orthodox view? You said that it's how did you say it?
On pause.
What is on pause?
The teaching office.
The teaching
So,
office. Now,
so
why is that the case?
since the seventh ecumenical council, why haven't they had an eighth ecumenical council or a ninth or a
See,
tenth? We have
see this I'm completely ignorant about. Like I didn't know that there was even like a seventh or
yes.
potentially eighth ecumenical council.
So after the seventh one, they don't have any ecumenical councils.
When was the seventh?
Uh, um, Now you're asking a philosopher to come back down to history. I don't remember the dates. You know,
Okay.
pre 1000.
Okay. So they had
So
that ecumenical council, and then they've had nothing since then.
no, they can't because the Bishop of Rome has to be in communion to call an ecumenical council. That's how I
Okay.
understand it. I mean, I'm
Okay.
happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, but that's how I understand it. Is that they need the Bishop of Rome to be in communion to call an ecumenical council because it has to be ecumenical, right?
Ecumenical.
Yes. Um,
So the teaching office is on pause. Okay, for that reason.
yes. And so literally they haven't had an ecumenical council for over 1,000 years.
Okay.
It
And
seems to me,
that just seems weird. Like that, in terms of this like trust consideration, how can you
yes.
trust a organization that is just like on pause, so to speak?
Yes. I mean, I would say there is something to trust in an Eastern Orthodox view of the relevant type.
Uh huh.
So if a Protestant friend of mine was interested in becoming Orthodox, I wouldn't stop them. I would think that's progress into the fullness of truth, because then you have an infallible teaching office. The office happens to be on pause right now, but there is an infallible teaching office. They are real churches. The Orthodox churches are real churches. They have sacraments. They have the priesthood, right? They have the tradition. So to me, they are real churches. Um, Whereas to me, the Anglican churches it's a much more dicey affair, right?
Hmm.
Because unless the apostolic succession has been done according to the valid norms, right? Then the priest who is given holy orders, right, in an invalid way, right, might not actually be confecting the Eucharist, right? Even though we think, but it is possible because in the what was it, the 19th century, as I understand, many Anglicans would get holy orders through like Eastern Orthodox bishops, which have the holy orders, which don't go according to the way I believe Cranmer and that whole theological group in the English Reformation changed things. So if you do things according to those rules, then the Catholic Church has defined that to be invalid. So holy orders can't come through those rules because they changed the rules. Whereas the Orthodox have the same rules as Catholics, so they can actually ordain real bishops and real priests, and so they really have the sacraments and they really have holy orders. So, with respect, maybe the Anglican church I went to back in California, it was possible that priest was ordained by a bishop, and that's what he claimed, be ordained through the Eastern Orthodox line, so as to be actual valid holy orders. And that's a debate on the ground, a case by case debate, even though the Catholic Church declared the holy order form of the Anglicans to be incorrect.
Before we close out the interview, and it's already been about an hour so far, and these things go by so fast. Is there any big parts of your story that maybe I haven't heard that are relevant here?
I mean, I think when you're talking about conversion, you're always talking about everything in your life.
I
So
know.
to me, a conversion, whether it's from one worldview to another, or from Protestant to Catholic, right, or to me from, like, let's say, one version of epistemology to another, right, it reorients everything, right? So you have kind of, I like the model in epistemology, that the metaphor of a web of belief, right, where there's central beliefs, and those are, if you change those, it radically changes many things. It changes the whole structure of your beliefs. And where there's some things on the outside of that web that you can change, it doesn't radically change the structure. But to me, a conversion is a radical change of structure. So it's impossible to assess without assessing everything in a certain way. But I would say this, and I wanted to read this to you and see what you think. This is something I read when I was Catholic. It's a very short selection from a letter that Gerard Manley Hopkins wrote to his father. So Gerard Manley Hopkins was a Jesuit poet in the late 19th century. He was an Anglican convert to the Catholic Church through John Henry Newman and his whole Tractarian Oxfordian movement, right, of converts from Anglicanism into Catholicism. And he said this, and I remember I read this, and it made a big difference to me in how I kind of considered the evidential playing field, if you will, right? That might communicate to you what I mean. So his father, in the context of this letter, his father's asking him to delay conversion. And he says, I don't want to delay conversion because I believe that, the Eucharist is Christ and he's offering me himself, and I don't want to delay, right? And so that relates to some of the stuff we talked about in my backyard about
Yeah.
passive wager and stuff like that, which is an important thing we could cover some other time, on the show or in person. I don't care, whatever you want. But super important stuff for me. That was important stuff we haven't covered. But at any rate, he then says this to his father. He says, about my hastiness, I wish to say this. If the question, which is the Church of Christ, could only be settled by laborious search, a year and 10 years and a lifetime are too little when the vastness of the subject of theology is taken into account. But God must have made his church such as to attract and convince the poor and unlearned as well as the learned. And surely it is true, though it will sound like pride to say it, that the judgment of one who has seen both sides for a week is better than he who has seen only one for a lifetime. I am surprised you should say fancy and aesthetic tastes have led me to my present state of mind. These would be better satisfied in the Church of England, for bad taste is always meeting one in the accessories of Catholicism. My conversion is due to the following reasons mainly. I have put them down without order. 1, simple and strictly drawn arguments, partly my own, partly others, so that is relevant. Common sense, reading the Bible, especially the Holy Gospels, where texts like "Thou art Peter," right, parenthetical, the evasions proposed for this alone are enough to make one a Catholic, end parenthetical, and the manifest position of St. Peter among the apostles so pursued me that at one time I thought it best to stop thinking of them. Number 4, an increasing knowledge of the Catholic system, at first under the form of Tractarianism, which was Newman's traditional Anglican view, later in its genuine place. And in this increasing knowledge of the Catholic system, sorry, to continue the quote, which only wants to be known in order to be loved, its consolations, its marvelous ideal of holiness, the faith and devotion of its children, its multiplicity, its array of saints and martyrs, its consistency and unity, its glowing prayers, its daring majesty of its claims, etc., etc. You speak of the claims of the Church of England, but it is to me the strange thing that the Church of England makes no claims. Right? It is true that Tractarians make them for her and find them faintly or only in a few instances borne out for them in her liturgy and are strongly assailed for their extravagances while they do it. Right? So that's the end quote of that quote. And that struck me because I think the ultimate motives for becoming a Catholic are much, much broader. Arguments are part of it, right? But it ultimately comes to, this is a beautiful thing that God set up, and he wants us to join it to love us and to be loved by us. And I think ultimately, after I became Catholic, I saw those things more clearly, and those motivated me along the way. Like a poem here, a quote here, like that friend of mine back when I was an undergrad saying, "Where's your joy, brother?" These little voices of God, right? And those things, I think, make a big difference, because God is trying to bring us all, right, into the fullness of truth. Of course, Catholics believe that that is the Catholic system, right? But I think if you can't understand those motives and you're interested in Catholicism, then you're pursuing it all for the wrong reasons, right? Because it's ultimately about Christ, right, trying to come close to his people and bring them close to himself, and continue that kind of sanctification, right, of his people for the sake of each other, for the sake of his glory, for the sake of the world. And so I would end with those reflections and say those all have huge weight to me and shouldn't be underestimated.
Do you mind sending me that quote so I can put it in a comment in this video?
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, because that's something I need to just like sit down and reflect on for a while. Unfortunately, I haven't had much time to update that Bayesian analysis that you and I were talking about. Like I've that's all I want to spend my time doing, but I'm just so busy with other things that I haven't gotten around to really updating it, or even thinking more about like, is this the right way to go about it? I'm starting to have doubts about that. I mean, so, but it's all in good. Like this has been a really fun journey. I have to say, and getting able to talk to people like you, it's been a real pleasure and a real honor. And but I really appreciate you coming on today. It's been awesome. It's been great.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say something positive about you, but I'll let you finish, then I'll say something positive about you.
Okay. I think that's pretty much all I had.
I was going to say that I think that you having this show, right, and being a model of somebody who is pursuing the truth, right, and you are not going to compromise on that. And my Protestant mentors and friends all encourage me in that, and that is what we're ultimately loving, right, and we're ultimately trying to pursue. And your model of doing that yourself, very carefully, asking questions, wanting to slow down, wanting to think about it, I think that models the kind of intellectual virtue, right, that I think a person who is serious about holiness and isn't just going on some pretentious search, right, but actually wants to understand what God teaches and to believe what he says, right, on his authority. I think that is a model that every Christian, Catholic or non-Catholic, needs to see modeled. And I'm glad that shows like yours and shows like Frad's, right, are on YouTube, and people are able to see this, right, modeled. It's a breath of fresh air, and I'm all for it. And I have no worries.
I really appreciate
that. Fears of people that seek the truth. God promised us, if you seek the truth, right, you will find it. There is no question. There's no anxiety. Wanted to tell you that, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That's really nice of you to say, Alex. Why don't we do this? I'm going to let the audience decide if I should have Dr. Plato back on the show. If you'd like to see him come back and talk more about Catholicism, what we haven't really talked about today is what you mentioned, Pascal's wager, and how that might play into these sorts of considerations. So if you'd like to see Dr. Plato back to talk about Pascal's wager, how that might actually affect some of what's going on here, then let me know in the comments right down below. Say, yes, I would love to have Dr. Plato back on to talk about Pascal's wager and Catholicism. And let me know. That would be awesome. But it's been great to have you here. And I wish I had as cool of a last name as yours, but I'll have to just suffice with mine. It's although mine is like, I mean, if I do become Catholic, I guess it's going to be kind of appropriate, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Bertucci.
Hey.
Bertucci. You got to do the hand.
That's right. Absolutely.
Alex, it's been awesome. Can't wait to have another conversation with you, either here or in person. It's going to be awesome. But I will see you guys in the next video. See you soon. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the